let me begin by reviewing the direction I'll be taking in this talk. I'll use the expression the efficiency-equality trade-off, and there you see a picture of this thing which probably appears in every economics textbook, something like this, where we can have equality or we can have efficiency, but we cannot have both. Now, interestingly, if you study microeconomic theory, you'll find there's a bit of schizophrenia about the subject of the trade-off, because the fundamental theorem of welfare economics and the Coase theorem asserts that as far as wealth is concerned, we can support efficient outcomes, whatever the wealth distribution. However, the efficiency-equality trade-off says something quite different. It says, if you have a highly equal wealth distribution, you must necessarily have an inefficient economy. I think the difference in focus is one between the high theory, more or less the priests of economics, as opposed to the practitioners, the policy makers, and so on. I'll have something to say about the neutrality of wealth equality. Then I want to say something more about empirical studies, because, as you know, in the last 20 years, we've really revised our knowledge about the trade-off. Then I want to begin looking at the new economics that Oscar has just introduced. First, I'll talk about behavioral economics. Then I'll talk about contract theory. And I will use these two ideas from behavioral economics and contract theory to talk about the burden of inequality. And I'll show you how this burden really weighs heavily on the US economy and the economies of many countries in Europe. And finally, in closing, I want to talk about the future. I want to talk about the economy of knowledge, the economy in which we will have to do things differently in order to do well. And we'll have to learn how to cooperate in a knowledge-based economy. And I'll talk a bit about the kinds of policies which might be necessary in order to do that. Now, let's talk about the conventional wisdom. As I said, the fundamental theorem of welfare economics has a simple statement. It says competitive interaction between buyers and sellers supports an efficient outcome, a Pareto efficient outcome, irrespective of the initial distribution of wealth. And secondly, the so-called Coase theorem, it's not a theorem actually, it's a very interesting paper. The Coase theorem says more or less the same thing. It says if you have efficient bargaining, then irrespective of the distribution of property, you'll have an efficient outcome. And of course, the word efficient in both cases means Pareto efficient. That is, it's an outcome in which no one can be made better off without someone being made worse off. Now, if you turn to public economics, development economics, the popular press, the talking heads on TV, they'll tell you a different story. They don't tell you that it doesn't matter, the distribution of wealth. We can have efficiency no matter how equal or unequal. They'll tell you that we have a trade-off. Unfortunately, they say, if we want to pursue equality, it's going to be a costly mission. And they then show us a figure like this. Now, the critical questions are the following. When this kind of graph is shown in a textbook, it said, well, basically we're at point B, and if we move to point C, we suffer inefficiency loss. But they don't ask, how do we know that we're on the frontier? Maybe we're at point A, here, in which we could move to point D. Now, that's a possibility which I think needs to be explored. Of course, every economy has its inefficiencies, and I want to suggest something which I think is very important for public policy. Many of the efficiencies of an advanced capitalist economy are there because of inequality. And removing the inequality is part of the solution. It's not part of the problem. Now, okay, here's a quiz. What will you find in every introductory textbook but cannot be found in reality? And of course you think maybe unicorns. But no, the answer is not unicorns. The answer is the efficiency-equality trade-off. I can assure you, you'll find it. By the way, even in a textbook by Joe Stiglitz, who changed the way we think about economics, you'll find even in his textbook a efficiency equality trade-off. It's more or less the kind of thing which every economist must swear to. I mean, religions have all of these sort of symbols to which they swear, and in economics, it seems to be the efficiency equality trade-off. However, even in the 80s, there were some early warning signs that maybe this particular unicorn did not exist. People began to compare the very rapid economic growth of the East Asian economies with the rather slower growth of most Latin American economies, along with the fact that the East Asian economies were highly equal, both in wealth distribution and particularly income distribution, compared to the Latin American economies. And that comparison began to make its way into public policy documents. Then, of course, there were a series of famous econometric papers published in top journals, which essentially made the argument that, to the surprise of economics, inequality is bad for growth. Now, I've never been very impressed with the econometric evidence, to tell you the truth, because they're mostly cross-sectional evidence. But what we really would like to know is, suppose we're in a particular country, Chile today. Suppose we make a change so that we have a more equal distribution of wealth or of income. What will be the consequences? That's a historical question. It's a dynamic question. It's not a question which you can easily answer looking at a cross-section. You probably should look at some countries that adopted a new policy, and then what happened. Well, it's very hard to do. I think those of you who are studying econometrics know that I'm talking about what's called an identification problem. We need somehow to have a shock, like an equality shock, and then see what happened. Well, you know, we did have a bit of an equality shock. In the advanced capitalist countries, after the Second World War, there was the development of the welfare state, the recognition of trade unions, and there was really an entirely new capitalism which came out of the Second World War and the Great Depression. And so I put before you some data. Here we have growth rates, and here we have investment, and here we have 1820 to 1870, and so on. This graph here is the post-World War II period. Now look at that graph. The golden age of capitalism was the age of trade unions and the welfare state. By double. That's what made capitalism work well. Unprecedented growth in the era of the powerful trade unions and the welfare state. Now, what are you going to say about that? I don't know. Many people say it's because of the trade unions and because of the welfare state that we had this growth. I'm not entirely convinced that it's a causal argument in the way it's put. I honestly don't know. I've studied this for decades, and I can't really say that I know that it's causal. But I can tell you one thing for sure. Having powerful trade unions and having a welfare state did not eliminate the possibility of rapid growth. It coincided with it, and perhaps it played a causal role.